Hello, my AP Econ students. Welcome to Micro Unit 1 review. Now, of course, this also works for macro. If you're taking macro as its own individual course, I would be doing the same exact unit to start off macro, so this works for both. The concepts overlap with both, so you can use it for either one. But for what we do, starting in the fall, we do micro, so I'm calling it micro, but it works for macro as well. These are just some of the basics here. Scarcity trade-offs, production possibilities curves, comparative absolute advantage, and then market versus command economies. And so some pretty simple things, but just some foundational things that we need to know as we go through. So first, of course, the reason we're here, scarcity. Okay, the fact that things are limited. Okay, sometimes they like to say it a couple different ways. Another way of saying it is the fact that there are limited resources that serve unlimited desires and wants. In other words, we are never for lack of wanting more of something, and the fact that resources are limited means there's simply not enough. And so by using a resource, because it's limited, by using a resource in one way, we cannot use it in another way. That means that there is a cost to using it. That's a good sign that a resource is scarce. If there is a cost to using it, it is almost certainly scarce, okay? And so if something was not scarce, it would not have a cost, right? Again, the best example we can use is probably the air we're breathing right now, or I'm breathing, and wherever you're at, you're breathing. So me breathing more of it or less of it does not mean you can or cannot breathe air. It doesn't mean there's going to be less for me later on in the day. I'm using it. There's really no cost to how I'm using it. I can use it as much or as little as I want, and for the most part, it's in abundance, and it's not creating a cost. But if I have a hamburger, I can either eat the hamburger now. Of course, if I eat it now, I can't do other things with it. I can't save it for later. I can't give it to a friend. I can't, share it with someone if I eat it. And so by eating it, I'm creating a cost in that I cannot use it another way. That is often called opportunity costs. Okay, so, there we go. Opportunity cost is usually the best definition. It's the next best thing we give up in order to have or do something. Okay, the next best thing that we give up. Again, in theory, by eating the hamburger, I'm giving up all the different things I could do with the hamburger. Most of those are implausible. Okay, it's really, if I didn't eat it now, what would I do with it? I'd probably save it for later, and that's really what I'm giving up. Or if I save it for later, what am I giving up? The opportunity to eat it now. So opportunity cost is, again, the next best thing you give up in order to have or do something. And then, of course, as I've alluded to, the fact of scarcity creates what we call these trade-offs. Anytime we use something, there's a benefit to using it, but then there's the cost of using it, what we're giving up in order to have it or do it. And so the costs and benefits represent the particular trade-offs, okay, of using something. And so I have to measure, is the benefit worth it? Is the benefit greater than the cost? What I get from using it or having it, is it greater than what I'm giving up? And we make these decisions all the time in our life, right? So we use the fancy word marginal. Okay, marginal, remember, means additional or the next. Whenever we make a decision, we always make a decision, what economists sometimes call at the margins. In other words, based on the next benefit and the next cost of using it. We don't do it based on the averages. Okay, so the example that I give in class is during the school year, on average, it probably makes sense to get up at a certain time. Maybe that's 6:30 in the morning for you, okay? On average, because most during the school year, 5 out of 7 days a week are school days, and so it makes sense to get up at 6:30. Does that mean on Saturday you still get up at 6:30? It's probably very unlikely, because the additional costs and benefits of getting up at 6:30 on a Saturday are very different than the additional costs and benefits of getting up on a school day. And so most likely many of you all will sleep in on a Saturday because the costs and benefits are different. Some of you, if you have an early morning flight, you might get up at 4 a.m. Because you want to get on the 6 a.m. flight to go to Hawaii or wherever you're going. And so those things factor in as well. And those are important, right? So we want to think about that. And so again, it's just the next thing we give up. The marginal benefit is the additional benefit. The marginal cost is the next cost. And of course, we try to maximize the use of our resources by consuming something or using a resource until the benefit reaches the cost, okay? And again, as is typical, the more we do something, the additional benefits tend to decline. So think about when you're starving, the first slice of pizza you eat is a little bit of heaven. The 12th slice of pizza you eat is not so much. So the more you consume something or have something, the benefits tend to decline. Costs, on the other hand, tend to increase, marginal costs increase, and so you've got declining benefits, increasing costs. Where they meet is your optimum point, okay? That's what we call, of course, equilibrium. All right, so just some thoughts on scarcity and marginal and things like that. So let's go on to our next slide here. Production possibilities curves, okay? So a couple things to note here, and this thing's not being friendly, there it is. All right. Production possibilities curve represents, okay, usually we'll take two items and it'll tell you the various combinations of those two items that we can have. Remember, we can't have unlimited everything because things are scarce, but what are the combinations that we can have? Okay, as you look at a production possibilities curve, it's going to make several assumptions. Okay, so let me look at the curve down here. And so this curve, whether it's a straight line, which we'll see here, or bowed out, as we'll see on the back, or on the next page, this curve represents the maximum combinations that we can produce if we use all of our resources. Okay, so we're assuming whether we're point A, B, C, D, E, or F, given these two items, that is the most, the biggest, the maximum that we can possibly make given that reality. If we are inside the curve, then that means that we have resources that are left over. Okay, so if we were any point inside, that means we could have made more. Why we didn't just depends. Could be a number of reasons. Any point outside of the curve, remember, is unattainable. Okay, as much as you would like to go to college full-time next year and work full-time and backpack through Europe to find yourself, and you keep on those, that's an impossible combination of uses of your resources, right? You can't do all that. You don't have enough time, money, whatever else, and so you have to make decisions. So this curve represents the maximum. That means anything beyond that cannot possibly happen. We do not have the means or the resources to make it happen. And the other thing about this curve is it never tells you what is the best combination. Best combination is entirely relative to the individual situation. Should you make more of this product or more of this product? Again, it depends entirely. It does not tell you what is the best or optimal combination. It just says these are the options. These are the possibilities. Okay? Now, in this particular situation, this is what we call a constant opportunity cost. Okay? It's going to be represented by a straight line. If you see a straight line, you know it's a constant opportunity cost. And they like to say, the fancy word of saying is because resources are perfectly adaptable. Okay? So perfectly adaptable resources. And so as you go from one point to the next, again, as you go from A to B, you drop 3 of this product, but you gain 3 of this product. As you go from B to C, you drop 3 here, you gain 3 here, and so forth. It's always, in a sense, a 1-to-1 ratio or 3-to-3 ratio as you move from point to point. And this is because when resources are perfectly adaptable, the processes, the skills needed, all the knowledge, all these things are pretty much the same. So the example we use in class, you can make ham sandwiches or turkey sandwiches. The process, the resource, everything is pretty much the same. It's pretty easy to transition from one to the next, and so you don't lose a lot in the process. Of course, most products, most things in life are not perfectly adaptable. There is an increasing opportunity cost, and that means that the curve is bowed outward, okay? And so what that shows is because resources are imperfectly adaptable. All right, because they're imperfectly adaptable, that means that going from one to the next is very difficult. Here they use the example of healthcare and education. The classic example is pizza and robots that we used in class. But the idea is as you move from point to point, if I start here at all healthcare and no education, if I want to add some education, notice I don't give up a lot of healthcare in the process. My healthcare, I gain a lot of education up front. I don't give up a lot of healthcare. As I move from point to point now, though, look as I go from C to D or from D to F or whatever, if I go from C, which is right here, to D down here, I start dropping a lot of healthcare, okay? in order to gain more education. And the reason, again, resources are imperfectly adaptable. The process, knowledge, skills, everything is entirely different. And so going from one to the next is very difficult. All right, and lastly, movements in the curve. Okay, it is possible for the curve to move. In the short run, things are fixed, and it's probably not possible, but in the long run, it can. If the curve moves outward, that usually indicates, that's a good sign that we've experienced some economic growth. Economic growth, obviously, we like. Why would we experience economic growth? Usually, it's because of improvements in technology or human capital, human resources, things like that, so that we can make more with the goods and services that we have. So think of the Industrial Revolution or the technological revolution or things like this. That would be a good indication that we've had economic growth. We can have more of all these things, and that's good. It is possible for the curve to move inward. Inward is not a good thing. That means that we have a lesser combination of these particular resources that we can have and produce, and that's not good. Usually this happens after a war. Think of a war that devastates a nation, factories have been bombed, workers have been killed, things like this. Natural disasters, hurricanes, wiping out towns or coasts or whatever else, or some other calamity that would hinder our ability to produce goods. We obviously don't like that. That would be bad, but it can happen. And lastly, sometimes they'll differentiate between consumer and capital goods. Okay, consumer goods are any goods that we produce and are going to consume right now. Capital goods are goods that we're producing for some future consumption. Usually those are things like investments in technology and resources or research and development or things like that. And so typically the more we invest in capital resources, we will have greater future growth because we'll have new technology and new factors of production and things like that we can use to produce greater things. And so, again, there's not a right or a wrong. It depends entirely on the situation. When we're at war and we're fighting for our nation's existence, we're going to be producing a lot of consumable goods, things that are going to be produced and used immediately, things like tanks and bullets and bombs and battleships and things like that, food. When we're at peace and things are prospering, we might tend to invest more in capital goods. Again, there's not a right or a wrong. It depends entirely on the circumstance. All right. Next page, you got comparative and absolute advantage. Okay, so the definitions of both are important. Absolute advantage means simply you can do it better. Absolute advantage is easy. You can produce the product better than the other person, either with, depending on how they phrase it, either with the same number of resources you can make more, or it takes you, to make a single unit, it takes you fewer resources, usually measured by hours, but it can be measured by other things. Comparative advantage means that you can produce the item with the lower opportunity cost. That's important, and there's a little bit of math involved here because you got to figure out opportunity costs. So comparative advantage is trickier than absolute. Absolute is easy, it's just who's better. So looking at the chart here, again, we can figure out absolute advantage rather quickly. It says using the same amount of resources, Bob can make 6 bottles of ketchup, where Tom can make 12. Tom is clearly better at making ketchup than Bob is. He makes 12 bottles versus Bob's 6. And when it comes to mustard, Bob can make 3 bottles. Tom can make 4 bottles. Tom is also better at making mustard. So Tom, we would say, has the absolute advantage in both ketchup and mustard. He does both better, or he can make more given the same amount of resources. Okay, now that's easy. To figure out comparative advantage, though, like I said, a little bit of math involved. We have to figure out our opportunity cost. Now, when you're given a chart like this, where it says using the same resources, this is how many of each you can make, we have a fancy little rule called other goes over, where we can figure out what do you give up what does Bob give up to have 1 bottle of ketchup. Now we know for Bob to make 6 bottles of ketchup, he gives up the chance to make 3 bottles of mustard. But we want to get this to a 1 to something ratio so that we can compare the two people or the 2 nations and make sure that we see who has the lower opportunity cost. So Bob ends up giving up 1/2 bottle of mustard to make his 1 bottle of ketchup. Again, all we're going to do is try to get this down to a 1-to-1 ratio. So we're going to do other goes over, so 3/6. And so he ends up with, as you can see there, a 1/2 bottle of mustard. That is his opportunity cost. Tom, to make his bottle of ketchup, he gives up 1/3 bottle of mustard. Again, other goes over, 4 divided by 12, and he gives up 1/3. So Bob gives up 1/2, Tom gives up 1/3. Again, what's our definition? Whoever has the lower opportunity cost. Well, Tom here has the lower opportunity cost, and so he has the comparative advantage in making ketchup. He gives up less. All right, let's do the same process and figure out who has the comparative in mustard. So for Bob, again, we know that Bob, to make 3 bottles of mustard, gives up 6 bottles of ketchup. Let's get that down to a 1 to something ratio. So other goes over, 6 divided by 3. So for Bob to make 1 bottle of mustard, he gives up 2 bottles of ketchup, 6 divided by 3. And so he gives up 2 bottles of ketchup. Tom, on the other hand, again, do the other goes over, 12 over 4. For him to make 1 bottle of mustard, he gives up 3 bottles of ketchup. So Bob gives up 2, Tom gives up 3. Well, Bob has the comparative advantage in ketchup. It should say making mustard because he gives up less. Okay, so that should not say ketchup, that should say mustard. Again, I will correct that before we get there, and this thing's off a little bit, so I'll fix that later. Anyway, now here's the trick. When deciding to trade, you always want to make your comparative advantage. Okay, make the comparative advantage and then trade. That's always better off for you. So every once in a while they'll throw in this wrinkle and ask about terms of trade. Okay, it's not very fun, just to warn you, but you may have to answer this. So the idea here is, as long as you give up less to trade than you give up to make it yourself, it makes sense to trade. Okay, so normally if we use the numbers up here, Tom wants to make the ketchup, because Tom has the comparative in ketchup. Bob wants to make the mustard. Like I said, I should say mustard. It's my fault. Bob wants to make the mustard. Now, normally, for Tom to make, if Tom was going to get his own mustard, Tom gives up 3 bottles of ketchup. So if he's going to trade with Bob, he has to give up fewer bottles of ketchup to do that. If Bob says, hey, I'll give you a bottle of mustard, but I want 4 bottles of ketchup in return, Tom would be like, bump that, I can make my own mustard where I only give up 3 bottles of ketchup. If you're asking for 4 bottles of ketchup for 1 bottle of mustard, not a good deal for me. I'll go ahead and make it myself. If Bob asks for anything less than 3 bottles, let's say 2 bottles, Bob says, look, I gave you a bottle of mustard, send me 2 bottles of ketchup. Tom's going to look at that and say, sweet action, right? If I'm making my own mustard, I get to give up 3 bottles of ketchup. I'm only giving up 2 to trade with you. I like this deal, okay? And looking at it from Bob's perspective, again, Bob wants to make the mustard, so he's going to make the mustard, get the ketchup from Tom. So normally Bob gives up 1/2 bottle of mustard to get his 1 bottle of ketchup. Again, as long as he gives up less than 1/2 bottle, it makes sense for him to trade. So same idea. If they ask terms of trade, you always have to ask yourself, what would it cost them to make this product themselves? Am I getting a better deal? If they're getting a better deal, then they go ahead and trade. If not, then they say no deal. All right, lastly, this one's pretty simple, what we call market versus command economy. So again, every society has to make the decision, how are we going to use our resources? Economists sometimes call these the what, how, and who questions. What are we going to produce? How are we going to produce it? And for whom are we going to produce it? Okay? Now, 2 general ways of answering this. Now, there are mixtures of both of these. Most economies are a mixed economy. But the 2 extremes of answering this is the first one's what's called a market system, sometimes called the free market, sometimes called capitalism. And that's a situation where individuals are free to make their own choices in how they use their resources. Okay, so a couple of characteristics that define a market system or a capitalist system. First of all is prices. In capitalism, we primarily use prices to help us know what to make, what not to make, what to buy, what not to buy. Prices guide consumers and producers, and this is all the stuff we talked about in Unit 2 when we talked about supply and demand and how that creates market claim price. Okay, so prices are a big part of that economy. Private property, which is generally the idea that people are free to own the fruit of their labor. When you produce something, it belongs to you. You can do with it what you want. Okay, it's yours and you own it, you have rights to it. Voluntary exchange, people are free to trade what they own or not trade what they own for what somebody else owns. Okay, so I can go to the store and I can either make a transaction or say, no, I'm not interested in that. The store also has the same right. And then competition is just the idea that buyers compete against buyers for goods, sellers compete against sellers for the patronage of the various customers, and that's a big part of it as well, is this competition. Okay, the other extreme is what's called a command economy. Sometimes we know it more like socialism or communism. And that's a situation where either the government owns most of the resources, and so the government, not individuals, making their own free choices, but the government is making choices about what happens to those resources, and or, like I said, makes most of the decisions with how the resources are used. And so that would, again, if you think of socialism, something like that, that's where the government is making most of these decisions, not through prices and voluntary exchange and all these things that we talked about up here. So that's market and command economy. All right, so that's our Unit 1 review. Again, pretty simple stuff for the most part. Hopefully that makes sense. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. And otherwise, until next time.